Heated lid? Oh yeah, you did. This way, when all that water evaporates out of your sample, it doesn't condense on the lid, leaving everything else behind, all your nicely calculated concentrations, down the trash. So often when we're using one of these thermal cyclers, sometimes they're referred to as PCR machines because we use them a lot for PCR, where we run them in these cycles of getting hot and cold and hot and cold and hot and cold in order to make lots of copies of a specific region of DNA. And we can also use it, like I'm using it right now, just as an incubator, so I can keep tubes at a specified temperature. Now, in order to keep the liquid stuff all together, you need to do something to prevent all of the water from evaporating and then condensing in the lid. So going from being a liquid to being a gas to being a liquid again on the lid, and then leaving everything else behind. So the reason why the heated lid helps is that it's going to make it so that when that water gets to the lid, it's not just going to find a cold surface to hang out with. So the reason why the water is going to evaporate in the first place is that you're giving the water molecules the energy to break free from their interactions with one another. So the reason why water would be a solid, so ice, or a liquid, so liquid water, or a gas, water vapor, depends on how much energy the molecules have. So water molecules have kind of like a love-hate relationship with one another. If they have enough energy, they'd like to just be by themselves. But if they don't have enough energy, well, now they stick to water's really sticky, so it sticks to each other because it has partially positive parts and partially negative parts, this whole thing called polarity. And so what happens is that if the water molecules don't have enough energy to overcome those interactions with one another, then they're a solid. If they can kind of escape for a little bit, but only kind of slide past one another before they get dragged back in by another water molecule, they're a liquid. And if they have enough energy to totally just hang out by themselves, we call them a gas. So which they are is going to depend on how much energy. And how much energy, well, that's talking about heat. So heat is an average measure of the average kinetic energy of the molecules, or how much movement they can do and stuff. So if we add heat, in one of these machines, when we get up to those stages in the PCR reaction where you're melting the DNA, so you're actually separating the strands, we can be going up to 95 degrees or so. And so this can be even if it's, okay, well, that's below 100, which is the boiling point of water, right? Well, the boiling point is when half of the water molecules have enough energy to be a gas. And so below that, you're still going to have water molecules evaporating, so becoming a gas. But what happens is you get this kind of equilibrium between the water becoming a gas and the water becoming a liquid. So if you have some closed container, you're going to get this equilibrium if you're not changing the pressure or the temperature. What happens though is that if the water molecules come out, because like we said, water molecules can evaporate even if you're below the boiling point, they're going to come out and they're going to go up. The water molecules are going to move from where there's the most heat, where they have the most energy, to where there's the least heat. And so if you don't use a heated cap, that least heat place is going to be the lid. So the water molecules are going to go travel up. The water molecules, as a gas now, are going to go float up and hit that lid, and now the lid is cold, and they're going to transfer some of their energy to that lid. Plus they're going to make interactions with that lid that then make them stick a little bit to the lid. So bottom line, the water molecules now don't have enough energy to overcome the attractions both to one another and to the lid, so they're going to condense. They're going to become a liquid again, and they're going to become a liquid again on the lid, leaving everything else behind, because those other things are not volatile. They can't evaporate as easily as water. So those other things can be really important though, things like the salts and the proteins in there. If you're running a PCR, you have the DNA polymerase, you have the dNTPs, the nucleotides, you have the salts, you have all of this various pH stabilizers, all of this important stuff that's relying on being a certain concentration because they're surrounded in that water. And so when that water evaporates, it's like when you go to when you see one of those puddles and it evaporates and it leaves all that salt behind. That's kind of what you're doing. You're basically just distilling out the water. And so what happens is that all the pure water is going to end up on the top, and all the other stuff is going to end up down below. And now that other stuff is going to be at weird concentrations, much higher. You're not going to potentially have enough water for your reaction. And so these reactions were happening in really, really tiny volumes. And so we can be talking about like 5 microliters or so. So a microliter is a thousandth of a milliliter. So they're really small volumes. So even if you're just losing a tiny amount of water, that's a big deal. So by heating the lid, what happens is now the water molecules, when they evaporate, because they still will evaporate, but now you have the situation where you are able to establish that vapor, that equilibrium between the liquid and the gas without having to take into account that you have two pools of liquid going on, because you're not getting that condensation on that lid because that lid isn't cold anymore. So when the water molecules escape from here, they're just going to go back down. And you're able to get this situation where instead of just drawing water out of here and then drawing it over to here and now leaving more space open in that air for more water molecules to evaporate. And remember that if that lid is cold, the water molecules up there are going to be cold, so they're not going to have the energy in order to evaporate from up there. The water molecules are much more likely to evaporate down from the bottom where things are warmer. And then you just kind of like are distilling out the water, so just removing the water from down here and putting it up here. That's not what we want. So if we have the heated lid, well, now that's not what's going to happen, because at the top you're still going to have it hot. Typically, we set the heated lid to be a few degrees higher than the temperature we're using, or higher than the highest temperature we're using. So often if you're doing a PCR reaction, the lids will be set at about like 105 or so. Right now I'm just doing like a 37-degree incubation, so I set the lid to be like 45 degrees. And this is going to keep it so that the lid is not going, that the water that evaporates is going to not find a nice cold surface to lay down on when it gets to the top. Before they had the heated lids, people would actually like put a layer of oil on top of their reaction because the water can't like evaporate through the oil. So it would have the same sort of effect, but then you would have to actually like go and get your sample out from under the oil and stuff. So heated lids are much more convenient. So when water is below its boiling point, or even if it's not, it's going to evaporate from like the surface first, because that's where there's going to be less pressure. So there's going to be pressure weighing down from the air, and then there's also going to be pressure from the water when you're below the surface of the water. When you're at the surface of the water, though, you just have the air pressure and you don't have that water pressure, so it's easier to escape. So the water molecules are going to be able to escape when they're at that surface. And so when you take water molecules from that surface, well, now it's kind of like peeling a layer of an onion. There's a new surface underneath. And so if you're in just like an equilibrium, typically like so when we have the heated lid, say, where the whole thing is the same temperature, well, now those water molecules, the ones in the air, are just going to go back to the liquid down there. But if you have a colder surface at top, the ones in the air are now going to go to that colder surface up there. And what's going to happen is that then you're peeling back a layer of that onion and you're leaving more water molecules open in order to evaporate. And because you've taken those water molecules out of the air above, now there's still that lower vapor pressure, so there's less of that water in the gas phase already because you took it out of the gas phase, but up there. And so now your water molecules are going to be able to evaporate more, which is not what we want. And so by using the heated lid, we're able to prevent that from happening. So we're reducing the evaporation from the bottom in terms of like its consistent evaporation and going to the top. It's still going to be evaporating and not evaporating, but it's going to be happening like from the bottom to the air, to the bottom to the air, to the bottom to the air, and not getting trapped at that lid. So we don't want the lid to be serving as like a trap. The other good thing about heated lids is that they're going to help make it so that the heating is more efficient. So typically in these machines, you can see that you have this kind of like metal block where these tubes are going to be held in this kind of like metal bucket, and that bucket's going to get hot, and this is going to heat up all this part of the tube really well. But if you don't heat the lid, well, now you're going to have like more uneven heating, and it's going to make it so that the top things near the top are going to not get hot as fast and that sort of thing. So this can mess things up if you're not getting hot as fast, even if it's not just like a temperature gradient within your tube. If you're not getting the whole tube itself more hot as quickly, what can happen is that if you're doing like a PCR, you can get more non-specific products, because the PCR, the reason why you like heat things up is, well, to separate the strands, but then you keep it kind of hot when you're trying to bind like your primer, so the pieces of DNA that are supposed to bind really specific places. If you have it at a lower temperature, well, now those can bind at less specific places because they don't have enough energy to find the really, really specific ones. And so by allowing this more efficient energy transfer, heat, then this is able to allow it so that you hopefully get more specific products. So you want your heated lid to be in snug contact with the actual like PCR cap. And so these things, when you go down, if you have one like this, you press it down and then you kind of tighten it until like it's the place where you can feel it, and then go a little bit further without like totally squishing it. This is especially important if you're using these domed lids. So these can get squished pretty bad. And then it can actually collapse your tube and stuff too. You can collapse your tube with a non-domed lids as well, but you don't want that to happen, and so then you get it all crushed down. So make sure you have it at the right height where you get this nice snug contact between the heating element and the tube, but you're not smushing your tube. And yeah, so happy incubating and thermal cycling, and remember to use that heated lid, set it a few degrees higher than your highest temperature in your protocol or than your incubation temperature. And yeah, so happy heating.